Today we're going to talk about Irish in the 19th century in the United States. As we know, the Irish were a really big immigrant group, and they kind of occupy an interesting place in American history that we're going to look at today. So, by the end of the 19th century, Ireland had been colonized by the British for many centuries. Also, the Irish had suffered a lot of religious and cultural oppression under British control. The English conquest and colonization of Ireland began in the 12th century, and then by the 16th and 17th century, England began to confiscate more and more land. They established more Protestant settlements, even though the vast majority of the Irish were very Catholic, so that was a pretty big affront to a lot of Irish people living there. I mean, they were all Christian, but there were some pretty big differences at the time in terms of belief. British law restricted Irish Catholic people's right to worship, to participate in politics, and a really big one, to own land. So ethnic and religious conflict between the native Irish Catholics and the British Protestants really, big time, started to develop. Many British immigrants to the U.S. held pretty negative attitudes towards Irish Catholics, and those were carried over by a lot of the people who were from Britain earlier on that ended up in America, and they would continue to have negative attitudes about the Irish there as well. The Great Potato Famine devastated Ireland from about 1845 to 1849. About 1 million Irish died from starvation or related diseases, and about 1 million Irish Catholics emigrated to other countries, a big one being the United States. Unlike earlier Irish immigrants to North America, these immigrants were often super poor, very uneducated, and very not very skilled. So here we just have a little sheet music cover from a song from Lovely Erin's Sad I Come song, talking about coming to the United States from sad Ireland. So as a lot of these groups came over, they were very, very close-knit and very much so stuck together. A lot of them did move to rural areas of the East Coast or maybe the Midwest, here in St. Paul or the West, but a huge amount settled in industrializing cities in the Northeast, usually finding works in factories. As we've talked about before, because the factory work was pretty easy and the workers pretty replaceable, a lot of those immigrants were hired right away to work in the factories. And if they didn't like the conditions, there would be more Irish people to show up who would get paid less than what people were asking for. Many Irish women did domestic work, working for more affluent people in cities, so watching kids, washing dishes, making food. And a lot of these Irish immigrants often faced discrimination in employment and in housing. Some of the big reasons for this, why there was so much anti-Irish sentiment, had to do with a lot of these people were poor. And they were able to settle in a lot of America's urban slums, kind of what we would call the ghetto today, because that's the only place that they were able to settle. But a lot of people kind of looked down on them for settling in these kind of nasty, sometimes crime-ridden areas, and then associated Irish people with crime and nastiness. For example, the densely populated Five Points neighborhood in New York had a huge Irish population in the 19th century. Native-born Americans, again, commonly associated the Irish with violence, crime, disease, alcohol abuse. A lot of the newspapers oftentimes portrayed pretty exaggerated versions of these stereotypes too, which we'll see here in a second. Irish immigration represented a demographic and religious shift in the United States. All those incoming Irish immigrants were mostly Catholic, while the majority of Americans at the time were Protestant. The influx of Catholic immigrants brought to light centuries of a lot of religious tension and heightened anti-Catholic sentiment. Many native-born Protestants argue that Catholics had a stronger allegiance to a foreign power, the Pope, than the U.S. government. That's something we've talked about before, that a lot of Americans were distrustful of Catholics because they thought they took their marching orders from a dude in Italy wearing a weird white hat. Here we have a newspaper coming from New York showing a family, an Irish family in the Five Points neighborhood of New York, and we can see they look pretty destitute, not really living in a house. We can kind of start to see this caricature of an Irish man. He looks kind of grizzled and kind of gorilla-ish. We'll see that gorilla thing kind of come out even more, and poor little kid doesn't have any shoes on. Going back to the issue about Catholicism, so a lot of these Irish immigrants were met with this idea that might sound a little familiar today in 2024 called nativism. You can see it right up there at the top. It's the belief that immigrants inherently pose a threat to the United States. Nativists in the 1840s and 50s argued that Irish immigrants threatened the interest of native-born Protestant Americans and the existing Anglo-American cultural values. Again, some of us might be like, well, what the heck? Irish people live right by England. How different could their values be? Well, different enough that they got a lot of hate from the people in power at the time. The religious influence of the Catholic immigrants was a big concern for nativists at the time. So much so that this kind of unofficial political party popped up called the Know Nothing Party, which they prided themselves on being ignorant and being xenophobic and being super strongly anti-Catholic, anti-immigrants. And this party aimed to stop foreign influence, establish a longer naturalization period, meaning it would take longer for Irish people to become citizens, to exclude immigrants from political office. And a lot of times, tension between the party members and immigrants definitely became violent. There was a whole bunch of riots during the 1850s. In the late 19th and early 20th century, there was a mass immigration from Europe, and the understandings of race shifted as immigrants started to get grouped into different kinds of races. We'll learn about the Chinese coming in through the West in a little bit. But big events like the Chinese Exclusion Act, Emancipation, Reconstruction, kind of shifted how a lot of people thought and saw groups of people different than them. Before it was just anti-Irish. We can't really call it racism, but this idea of race starts to influence a lot of the politics at the time here. And we got a nice painting here of a Catholic church on fire, because that type of stuff happened a lot. So the big central historical question that we're going to be asking ourselves today is, were the Irish considered whites in the United States in the 19th century? We're going to be looking at a few different documents to kind of tease out what we're talking about when we mean whites. In document A, just a couple heads up, it uses terms like Saxon and Celt, and hopefully you can use this slide that we have up here right now to kind of understand how these words are used in this context. We can see a Saxon is seemingly a interchangeable term with Anglo-Saxon. It's a really old-timey word talking about white people of English descent. Celts is another name for people who are Irish. As we know, the Celts were an ethnicity that used to be all over Europe, but kind of the last place that they held on to was parts of Scotland, a little bit of Wales, and Ireland. And during the late 19th century, terms like Anglo and Saxon, Anglo-Saxon were sometimes used kind of what we would see as racial labels today, to talk about the whiteness of other European ethnic groups and to exclude them from power, to exclude them from politics, or just gaining a leg up for these cultural reasons. So the term Celt was often employed by nativists to really racially distinguish themselves from Irish immigrants here. And we can see a couple of the documents. We're going to be looking at some political cartoons, which is always fun. I can help you out a little bit on some of these cartoons here. We're going to go to slide 8 here. All right. Oh man, there's a lot going on in this political cartoon. This was by Thomas Nast, who we'll come across a few times. Published during the presidential campaign of 1868. In this cartoon, we can see Nast is the author. He's criticizing the Democratic Party for its opposition to different Reconstruction acts, and he's showing the idea that the Democratic Party threatens the rights and safeties of African Americans by the way that, you can see them stepping on the black guy down there. He's unable to reach the ballot box, which is that little thing over here that he's reaching out for. If we kind of focus on different parts of the cartoon itself, the figure standing on the far left represents an Irish immigrant. Again, he's got these kind of gorilla, subhuman features. He has a hat that says 5 points. Again, a reference to the kind of ghetto neighborhood with a lot of poor Irish people at the time. It looks like an ape. Tattered clothing. He's got a flask of probably whiskey in his pocket. And he has a big club that says, "A vote." Let's maybe think about what the symbolism is there. The guy standing in the middle is just supposed to represent a general white Southerner, maybe somebody who used to fight for the Confederates. We can see on his belt buckle, it says CSA for the Confederate States of America. He has a big knife that says "The Lost Cause" on it. The Lost Cause is going to be something we'll get a lot more in depth with, but it's the idea of, I don't know, just kind of like repainting what the Civil War was all about, in terms of like fighting for Southern freedom. Yeah, it's really weird backwards idea that kind of romanticizes what the South were all about. And then we have this other guy standing off to the far right who's supposed to be a wealthy northern businessman, probably factory owner. He's got a button on that says Fifth Avenue, which is like the ritzy financial district of New York City. He's got a big wallet that says "Capital for Votes," which is alluding to the process the Democrats would use to pay off immigrants, be it with money or booze or food to go vote, right? And then, of course, we got my poor guy down here, disenfranchised black American. Again, he's reaching out for the ballot box, but according to Thomas Nast here, he is being prevented both by violence and maybe with some other symbolism that you can see here with all these different white factions keeping him down. In the background, you can see... my bad. In the background, you can see what looks to be like a lynched person. You can see burning buildings. This is a reference to a lot of the Civil War draft riots that happened in New York, where poor people in New York were drafted to go fight. A lot of Irish Americans, and they didn't want to go fight yet, right? So they attacked draft offices, public buildings, government stuffs, and they also attacked African Americans too, with the kind of misplaced thought that like this is black people's fault that I'm getting drafted. Also, when you're at the bottom, you got to compete with other people at the bottom too. So there was a lot of pre-existing racial resentment between the Irish and African Americans over job competition as well. So, again, we're looking at, were the Irish considered white in the 19th century? I hope this quick little lecture helped. Yeah, that should be it for now.